So today I'm talking about theatricality within repurposed objects, repurposed items, and the sort of ramifications for how we might think about classifying these ideas, how they structure works of music, or how we consider agency both by subjects and objects in and of themselves. So examples of repurposed items in performance settings. So repurposed items, for the sake of what I'm discussing here, are items with a prior perceptible life, external to their current function within a performance. So why am I interested in this work? I was drawn to this because I think that a lot of these items and performances don't fit into easy categories. They can simultaneously seem to function as instruments, as a sort of installation. They have sort of varying degrees of temporality and autonomy, both of the objects or the collection of the objects over time. And I think that the existence of these lives and qualities contained within these objects during, prior to, and between performances prompt a number of questions concerning the sort of changing nature and identity of these items, as it is the sort of multifaceted nature of these items that makes the application of any sort of standard classification system difficult. Further issues arise due to the often custom-made or individualized qualities that are imbued on these items, due to both the sheer number of individual cases as well as the varying degree to which each of these items have often been abstracted from their original source and function. So I see this interest as significant because I think the answers to some of these questions are important, because the above issues prevent us from adequately discussing a lot of the music that results from these items and their performance, as well as our ability to kind of consider how the music that arises from these items and performances design and shape our conception of these items and the environments that contain them. I also think that another interest here is that these works seem to clash with what I see as traditional methods of organological classification that maintain more traditional sort of subject-object relationships that we expect for more established musical styles. So what I mean by this is that these more established perspectives tend to hold the subject and the object as these sort of discrete, separate entities that either act as the subject or as the performer, or are acted upon or through as the object or as the instrument in this case. And I think that this perspective is often sort of ill-suited for discussing these performances, as they sort of ignore the greater interactive, contextual, and sort of environmental factors in which these interactions are taking place. So we see more of a privileging of things like gesture or things like physicality that focus a lot on the individual, but we're not really focusing on the agency of these objects. And given how perceptible the sort of lifespan of these objects are, I think that it is important to kind of consider their agency within these spaces as well. So I think that one of the major ways that we tend to talk about these things is through this notion that these objects are found. This is a pretty common approach that pulls from Duchamp. So not to rehash too much here, but so the term found object is attached to the concept of the ready-made, which he used in 1916 alongside his use of everyday objects like the bicycle wheel here. And I think that this tends to clash with how we use these objects within musical cases. So a lot of his initial use of this term pulls from a sort of critique of industrialism, as well as an interest in more conceptual or non-retinal art. There's a quote Duchamp that I pulled from an Ashline article that says, let's say you used a tube of paint. You didn't make it, you brought it and used it as a ready-made. Even if you mix two vermilions together, it's still a mixing of two ready-mades. So man can never expect to start from scratch. He must start from ready-made things. Since the tubes of paint used by artists are manufactured in ready-made products, we must conclude that all paintings in the world are ready-made aided, and also the works of assemblage. What he's saying here is that there's sort of he's suggesting a sort of impossibility of painting because of this sort of movement towards industrialization. Yeah, we see these sort of found objects and ready-mades not as a expansion of what can be considered or viewed a work of art, but instead they sort of suggest this sort of impossibility, right? As any given ready-made is no less found, repurposed, and assembled than any given painting, thanks to the standardization of the art form under industrialization and mass production. So in a lot of these cases, I feel that the way that we're actually using these objects in musical performances don't tend to sort of pull from this idea. I think that they tend to be more of an expansionist kind of idea, where we're using these objects because of the sounds that they bring to a space, and we're sort of using these sounds as these sounds to sort of expand what we consider music or sound or noise or any of these other different ideas. So I think there's a little bit of a clash with this idea of expanding our concept of music versus this sort of reduction or suggestion of, say, impossibility of music after a certain point. In the same way, I think this shift moved towards a conceptual shift. It tends to also have a little bit of an issue meshing seamlessly with this term found object. Because in a lot of these cases, while there may be some sort of conceptual background to this music, or a lot of conceptual background to this music, I feel like a lot of the meaning of the work doesn't seem to be non-aural or contained solely within the mind of the viewer. We are still sort of hearing these pieces and considering their musical or oral qualities. So in this case, in a sense, the music is still sort of contained within its own sort of borders as an object. Despite this, I think that the term found is obviously used in an attempt to kind of emphasize the specific lifespan and qualities contained within a repurposed item. So this issue to me seems to be more that this term doesn't seem to fit very seamlessly, and it feels a little bit reductive, right? We're sort of saying that this item has been found, it's been found by the subject, and we're still sort of prioritizing the subject in this way, rather than the sort of agency of the objects that I think is kind of important in a lot of these cases. So one way that I thought was a bit more clear and sort of starting to sort of interrogate this this idea is the sort of conversation that Donald Judd and Michael Fried have in the 60s about minimalist artwork, or what Fried calls literalist artwork. So to give background to this, Donald Judd, in his manifesto, Specific Objects in 1965, calls attention to the direct use of materials in his three-dimensional work, as well as in the work of others. For Judd, the most important quality of his work and the work of his peers was its holistic quality, and by this he means that these works sought to omit clear parts or areas, contrasts, variations, and other representational components of an artwork that are inherited by format. So this might be the part-by-part compositional approach to much of sculpture, or the sort of flat rectangular plane of painting on a canvas that seems sort of inescapable from the art form. So by omitting these details to function as one simultaneous singular whole, the objects of Judd and others were able to become specific and act directly on the observer by extending its immediate presence into the environment that defines its three dimensions. And then there's a longer quote here where Judd kind of expands upon these ideas in his manifesto. The more important part being this idea that the form of a work and its materials are obviously closely related. So where I start to draw this idea of theatricality is where Fried kind of establishes this idea as a critique of this idea that that Judd puts forth of specific objects. So Fried writes about this 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, and he takes issue with a number of these prior statements. So his main criticism of Judd is in his work's use of wholeness or singleness of shape as a means to project objecthood or specificity. For Fried, this projection of objecthood denies an artwork the ability to contain its own meaning, but instead includes the context and the beholder in the projection of its objecthood. So Fried writes, here again, the experience of being distanced by the work in question seems crucial. The beholder knows himself to stand in an indeterminate, open-ended, and unexacting relation as subject to the impassive object on the wall or floor. In fact, being distanced by such objects is not, I suggest, entirely unlike being distanced or crowded by the silent presence of another person. The experience of coming upon literalist objects unexpectedly, for example, in somewhat darkened rooms, can be strongly, if momentarily, disquieting in just this way. So for Fried, the simultaneous distancing and inclusion of the beholder in the presence and experience of the art object caused it to become both anthropomorphized and durational. The art object's anthropomorphic qualities arise from the human characteristics ascribed to the art object as the beholder considers the presence of the work within which they are contained, much like an encounter with another person. This interaction imbues the work with duration, as the presence and the meaning of the work is now tied to how the work is perceived over the course of its viewing. So Fried saw the anthropomorphic and durational qualities embedded in the presence of these objects as fundamentally theatrical in a way that he considered antithetical to art making, as these works no longer contain their own singular presence as expressed by their medium. And this is where I break with Fried. I think that this idea that that these lines are sort of blurred between how an object contains its own presence, or how a subject is involved within the presence of the object, is just what makes for this so interesting. And what is starting to make what makes a lot of these works that use repurposed items so interesting is exactly this sort of boundary line blurring between how these objects play off of each other within a space, how the subject maybe interacts with these objects or does not interact with these objects if they have more of a autonomous quality. So I think that this is sort of an interesting idea. And I think that we can kind of see how theatricality does have a sort of a lot of ramifications for a potential organology of these repurposed items, or of a future sort of technology-based music. So this debate between Judd and Fried provides necessary context for considering how traditional methods of organological classification that maintain traditional subject-object relationships have skewed our perception of repurposed items in performance settings. So Fried's perspectives on the distancing and inclusion of the beholder in the presence of the art object seems to mirror the core subject-object issue that many take with performances of technology-based music. So like Judd-specific objects, the technology of these performances is presented as a whole object introduced alongside the performer. The spectators of the work are necessarily included in the projection of the technology's presence due to a lack of overarching systematized knowledge regarding the function of the technology overall, and or the function of the technology within a specific setting. The projection of presence from the technology becomes anthropomorphized as a means for the spectator to contextualize the work, and durational as our perception and understanding of the presence of the technology changes over the course of the performance. So by taking on these qualities, I see these performances of technology-based music as sort of fundamentally theatrical. I think that the theatrical nature of repurposed items is therefore at odds with a lot of traditional methods of organological classification, because performers act with these items rather than through these items, and are therefore included alongside other spectators in the projection of the item's presence. Because of this, traditional expectations of the instrument medium to sort of meld with the performer and become an extension of their bodies fades away, as performances are therefore unable to act as a singular presence as expected by more traditional expectations of musical expectations of these sort of subject-object relationships. I think that the use of repurposed items seems to exacerbate this perceived problem even further, as our perception of the prior lives of these objects external to a site of performance only stands to increase our perception of an item's durational anthropomorphic qualities. Our acknowledgement of this change between the prior function of an item and its new function as a repurposed item within a performance imbues the item with new anthropomorphized and durational qualities as we gain a new understanding of the item against its context over the course of its performance. But I think what's key here is that this issue only seems to arise if we prioritize the agency of the subject over the objects within this space, and expect the objects to sort of contain their own presence within these works. If we see agency as something that's more distributed, more equally or equitably between subjects and objects within a space, as they both sort of make their contributions to a work, we can see how this sort of sense of theatricality that these objects contain does not undermine the performances in which these items are contained, but rather aid in guiding the actions, interactions, and perceptions of a performance. So there's this question then of how these items then return our sort of gaze as we interact with them within these performances or spaces. So I think a way to sort of consider this is through Brecht's concept of distanziation, which he discusses and defines in a 1936 essay called Alienation Effects in the Chinese Art of Acting. Through this term, he's referring to the sense of self-consciousness that's manifested in an audience member through the breaking of the fourth wall in a theatrical production. Brecht writes, the Chinese actor doesn't act as if there was a fourth wall apart from the three walls that surround him. He knows that he is being watched. At once, any sense of illusion familiar from the European stage is removed. No longer can the audience have the illusion to be an unseen spectator present at an event that truly takes place. The artist clearly expresses that he knows he is being observed. He observes himself. The artist's device of observing himself and artful act of self-alienation prohibits an identification so extreme that it leads to the spectator's loss of self. It creates a magnificent kind of distance to the dramatic actions. So for Brecht, the spectator's prohibition of identification with the events of the theater were necessary to guide the spectator towards an acknowledgement of what he deemed a real event by emphasizing the productive function as a component of the theater. What I want to focus on here is this idea that by acknowledging the spectator, the actor is able to remove the theater's dramatic illusions and involve the spectator in the unfolding event. While at the same time, the spectator is then able to return the gaze of the actor and alert them that they have been seen in the event as it unfolds. So what we get here then is a sort of two-way gaze, one that we can see between the subject within the space, perhaps the person that we consider the performer, the people that we consider the audience, and the objects that prior to this idea we might consider static, but in this case we may consider returning these ideas as we consider them sort of anthropomorphic, or we consider their own sort of agency within a space. So Brecht, through this notion of this two-way gaze, embedded in a moment of distanciation, provides us with a means to recast Fried's distance contained within the theatrical object and account for the interactive nature of the repurposed items contained within sites of performance. So in many cases, when we interact with repurposed items, we interact with them based on what we think they might do. But what these items do in return to us is not always clearly related to our intentions. These moments in which an object returns our gaze often guide a performance in unintended ways. As they return the gaze of the performer, the theatricality of these items suggests a level of autonomy by which these items seem to function more as non-human actors than as static objects. In order to properly account for this theatricality, I think that further investigation into this sense of autonomy is needed. There is some writing on this. Jane Bennett, in her book Vibrant Matter, talks about the sort of vibrancy of these materials and expands on this idea of autonomous matter, by which she means things that simultaneously act as marks of human action, but also command attention in their own right, both as human observers and of each other. And through this perspective, Bennett sees this ability for non-human material items to produce their own effects and affects as a form of vibrancy or material vibrancy. So Bennett suggests two main elements for this sort of vibrancy of things. She discusses affect and assemblage. Affect in this case refers to a thing's potential capacity to act upon or be acted upon by other things. And it's through effective systems that agency is seen as fundamentally distributed rather than enacted through an intentionality. And I think this is starting to get closer to this idea of what we're seeing in a lot of these performances, is that there is a sort of distribution of agency between both the things in and of themselves and the performers and audience members within these spaces. So this system of effective forces derived from a collected network of things constitutes an assemblage, which Bennett defines as a collection of emergent properties structured by things in an event space. These assemblages have no central authority. Instead, the duration, trajectory, and specific function of any given assemblage is determined by the mutual effective forces of the things contained within it. Bennett elaborates on this idea by aligning it with Deleuze's concept of adsorption, which refers to a gathering of elements in a way that both forms a coalition, yet preserves something of the sort of agential impetus of each element. So looking back to theatricality, assemblages of effective systems allow us to describe what any given theater piece comprised of human and non-human actors does or did, because of how these concepts provide us with a means to describe how a convergence of interacting forces can contain a trajectory with any given moment, while maintaining the individual identities of both the sort of objects, repurposed or otherwise, and the subject across these moments of convergence. So I think in order for a system of organology to properly systematize these roles of repurposed items within performance settings, such a system should move away from defining the identities and roles in such items based on their sort of uniform productive capacities that we see as being awaited to be enacted by a performer lying in wait. Instead, such a system should consider the potential moment such items stand to enact through their cohabitations within a space. Such a reframing would necessarily constitute more of a relationally defined organology, one that focuses on the ecologies of items and their trajectories over the isolated attributes of any particular moment or thing, and their sole activation by the performer. So such an organology would account for a repurposed item or a non-human actor in this case, its material qualities and trajectories, internal and external performance context narratives, and ability to affect and be altered by other human and non-human actors in an effort to understand these items through the potential meanings they stand to enact as momentary assemblages of characters that both act and react to the sort of theatrical narrative settings and stagings that unfold in sites of performance.